Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this micro-focus webinar, Zero Trust Security, the Evolution of Trusted Identity. My name is Rob McDonald, and I'll be hosting today, and maybe even presenting a little bit. I'm a Solution Marketing Manager here at Micro-Focus. I look after the Identity and Access Management business in particular, and I have an awesome co-presenter here with me today, Nick Nichols. Nick Nichols is the VP of Strategy here, and we're super lucky to have him, and I love working with him. But he's for those of you that are not familiar with Nick, he's a former Burton and Gartner analyst, so he brings a lot of knowledge with him, which is awesome, so you guys will be able to benefit from that today, as will I. But before we begin, I'd like you to submit your questions, and I encourage you to submit questions. You'll see there's a little submit questions box on your screen there. Just type in the question or comment that you want in those in that area, and I'll be sure to get to those at the end of the session, where we'll have all those where we'll have time to answer all those questions. And you can do that throughout the session today. So I'll be watching for those. And just as a reminder, you can maximize your screen. So if you find the slides a little bit small right now, there's a double arrow at the bottom lower right of the corner of the slides. If you click on that, the slides will become bigger. And lastly, we are recording this webcast as well. So it'll be available on demand later on today. If you want to send it to all your friends or watch it again later on, you can absolutely do that. There'll also be a PDF copy of the slides there as well. So that's awesome. So I guess that's it. I think that's all I have to do. And let's get started. So Nick, are you with me?
I am. Thanks, Rob.
All right, buddy. It's all yours.
So today we're going to be talking about zero trust and how this really aligns with what's going on with identity and access management. And to begin, when we start talking about zero trust, there's a couple of things that I think are very important to acknowledge. Is that a lot of times we start this journey of trying to understand how to improve better security and provide a better protective environment by making certain assumptions. And this has been the way we've done things all along. And when we make assumptions, a lot of times, this is where we're sort of looking at things and saying, okay, well, this kind of makes sense, and we're going to accept this to be true. But often that isn't always the case. And so we have to be careful because obviously sometimes when you assume, certain things happen, right? And one of the things when it comes to cybersecurity specifically with regard to these kinds of assumptions is that we've tried to really simplify a very complex problem. And so when we look at things like network security, one of the key assumptions that was behind that premise was that we could define a secure perimeter, and that by drawing that line in the sand, everybody on the outside was suspect and everybody on the inside was okay. And so that's an assumption that I think over time we've seen, while it might be an effective place to start, a lot of times we end up having now, especially with cloud and mobility, our employees, our customers, our partners are on the other side of that firewall, and the services that we're even providing now are hosted in the cloud, and so there's no longer a clear delineation as to where that perimeter might be, and so that becomes a challenge. Also, when we start looking at the fact that we can be working from anywhere, that opens up these kinds of opportunities as well. And then lastly, the assumption that everybody on the inside is somehow okay is also a dangerous assumption, in the sense that a lot of times when breaches occur, it's through compromised credentials of insider accounts. And so the folks that we think are the good guys might actually have been compromised, and that's actually how a lot of these breaches progress, is by getting a foothold on the inside. So that's one view of sort of assumptions that were meant to simplify, but actually don't hold up as we move forward. Also, we look at endpoint security. Here's another set of assumptions, thinking that, well, if I just take care of all the malware, if I make sure that I can, put in the right antivirus and I can prevent the phishing and I can deal with the ransomware, that I'm secure. And it's like, well, yes, that's part of the problem, but it's not the whole problem. So assuming that that's the only thing that we need to focus on is not giving us the complete picture. Also, another example is with application security. I mean, it's very important to make sure that we're not introducing vulnerabilities into our code, but that's not the only issue. We still have breaches even in cases of where the code has no vulnerabilities. So we need to do the due diligence for each of these stages for sure, but as you can see, that security has many facets to it, and we really need to be thinking about it, in a more complete fashion. And that, each of these tactics, if you will, these approaches, only tackle parts of the problem. And one of the issues that we end up having is that when we break it down that way, and while I advocate for trying to simplify the problem by looking at parts of it at a time, but we still need to keep in mind the destination, what's the overall goal. And if you're only reacting, if you're only addressing the symptoms and not thinking about what the root causes are, or how to bring this together, you end up having a situation where you're just building a bunch of ad hoc problems on top of each other. You need to have a long-term plan. You need to have a strategy or an end game to be effective. And while most organizations have been more reactive, one of the challenges that we end up running into, and this comes from a ZDNet survey, is that they found that on average, organizations have basically acquired 70 different security vendors' products into their environments to help protect their environment. And I mean, that's a huge number if you think about it. How can you fill in all the gaps? These products from these large number of different vendors obviously aren't well integrated. So integration is left to the customer to try to perform, if at all, and they're only covering these narrow perspectives. They're not thinking about the bigger picture, and they're only again, it's a symptom of the reaction to the situation and addressing these problems as they arise and sort of putting band-aids on them rather than figuring out how to do them together and do this more holistically. And what this ends up having is an effect of where the goal was to increase agility and effectiveness. It kind of works against you over time. As these things build up, you actually end up having less effectiveness and less agility because all these things are now having to be integrated or manipulated or organized, and it becomes overwhelming, which just increases cost and complexity. So we're sort of working against the goals of what we were really trying to achieve by just going after point solutions without a plan. So as you can see, we need to think about this more holistically. So one of the things that when we start talking about zero trust is instead of just slapping a bunch of point solutions together, we kind of need to take a step back and recognize that some of the assumptions that we've made in the past where we were trying to build trust actually can work against us. And so deconstructing trust is actually a way to think about this problem in the sense that maybe I should increase my verification, increase my ability to assure that things are appropriate rather than just assume that we've got it covered. And so taking it to that next step involves understanding the context a little bit more. And so some of this is, first off, applying these zero trust concepts. So don't assume that you're going to have, a population of, folks in your organization that you can just rely on, and that their access is just going to be okay. I think that one of the things that you can really look at is, by taking this approach of really putting in the right access controls, much stricter controls at every point of access, we don't have to guess anymore. We can know. And by not trusting anything or anyone by default, we can really start to drive a much more effective security strategy. And in order to do that, you have to leverage context. You have to understand more than just where. And you can sort of think that the network security example of defining the perimeter was avoiding the whole aspect of identity, if you will. It wasn't about who you were. It was about more where you were coming from. And that's no longer the case. It really does matter who you are. And actually, there's something even more fundamental in that, and we'll touch on that in a moment. And really what this ends up coming down to is following the philosophy of least privilege. And this concept has been around for a while, but it's something that a lot of folks have kind of, maybe not pursued enough because they thought maybe it was too hard. But in reality, where we are today with the technologies that we have today, this is much more achievable. And being able to really understand and granting access only to what's needed and not providing excessive access and making sure that we're revoking access when it's no longer required is something that's very achievable today. And now another thing to really look at from this perspective is also that this isn't just a single plane that we're dealing with here, that this is actually a very much a multi-dimensional challenge. And so I use this example of a three-dimensional chess set to sort of sink this point home, is that if you're playing chess at only one plane, you're ignoring the other two planes and what's going on there. You're not seeing where threats may be coming from or even opportunities. And so understanding that you really do have to address all the dimensions of this problem and keep this broader focus actually can help make this much easier, believe it or not. And often organizations look at these different planes, if you will, as completely separate endeavors. So often an organization will sit there and have their identity team separate from their data team or separate from their applications team. And they really need to be working together. They really need to be all involved in this, because when we talk about this concept of how do I really define security and be effective around this, it involves all three components. And so what I mean by that is that if you're looking at zero trust, you could almost position every security challenge as a question as to, who is it that's taking the action? What is it that the action, what action is being taken, and what is being acted upon? And they generally fall into the three categories that I'm describing here in identities, applications, and data. And if you know all three of those components, now you can make a decision as to whether this is appropriate. If this identity that is taking the action, if I understand who that is or what that is, and if I understand exactly what the action is that they're trying to provide and trying to take, that then I can look at also what they're acting upon, and I can really get a good sense at that stage is that, do I have all the bases covered? Is this something that I would allow, and can I make a solid decision as to if this is something that we can really be comfortable with? If it's something that it's not, then obviously I need to deny it, or I need additional proof. If I don't know enough about who you are, if I don't know enough about what the action is, or if I don't know enough about the resource that you're acting upon, then I clearly don't have enough information to be able to grant that kind of access at this stage. So that's the concept behind this, is to really understand this context. And some of the techniques that can be brought to bear within a zero trust architecture help you do that. So first off, as I mentioned earlier, least privilege access really is an example of really driving the philosophy towards only granting what's needed, not granting more, not granting less. Microsegmentation helps to break down the environment, and this is actually one of the techniques that a lot of the network security vendors have started to adopt, because they realized that the perimeter was starting to dissolve, and so their response to this was we're going to put lots and lots of little perimeters everywhere. And it's still a useful technique, but it can't be done by itself. It still requires this view of identities, applications, and data as well. But breaking up into smaller segments can allow for tighter control over the movement of individuals within the environment, which can also help slow down any potential attacks where if something's been compromised and somebody gets into a certain area, that they can't just run the gamut. Another very key element to this is multi-factor authentication. This is providing us with that greater assurance that we know exactly who you are. Are you who you say you are? And how much can I rely on that based off of the information you've provided me? So multi-factor authentication provides a much greater understanding of the identity, and then also device and API control as well as monitoring around API interactions is also another aspect of this that's very crucial. So this isn't always happening at the level of carbon-based life forms interacting with systems. A lot of times this is programmatic interaction. And so when one service is invoking an API from another service, understanding that relationship, there's still an identity, there's still an action, and there's still the item which is being acted upon. Understanding that and putting in the right policies and controls around that programmatic access is absolutely critical as well. And the last part of this is with regard to adaptive access. And so understanding the current state, dynamically responding, and being able to really take the current context into account, and providing that as part of the decision making is also very crucial. So expanding on zero trust. So we really should be thinking a little bit differently around security, risk, and governance. And I've been alluding to this to some degree already, but one of the things that really helps simplify this whole perspective, which gives us some common ground to really look at this problem more holistically, is thinking about what are we really talking about from security. And so instead of thinking about security in the terms like we were talking about earlier about the assumptions of network security or endpoint security or application security, or we can go on different vantage points of security operations and so forth, right? We can start to find common ground. Is that even though lots of people come from different perspectives and they think about the security problems from that vantage point, it all really comes down to really understanding and enforcing what's appropriate. So if I take a network security context, I was trying to enforce what was appropriate by defining that perimeter. Okay, now that was taking those assumptions to try to make that happen, but my goal was to really enforce what was appropriate as far as access goes there. Looking at things from a perspective of endpoint security, for example, same kind of thing, is that obviously these viruses or malware that might be introduced are not appropriate, so I want to make sure I can limit what they, and clean that out so that way I'm not having anything bad happening on those endpoints. So I'm trying to enforce what's appropriate there. You can even take this as far as the concept of a lock and key. So even physical security, it comes down to enforcing what's appropriate. But when we start looking at it from that perspective, it actually helps us look at the bigger picture as well, in the sense that if I take that sort of view, I can start to define risk in similar terms. So risk being the measure for the potential for inappropriate activity, and governance is really the process for defining what is appropriate. So this is the decision-making aspect of deciding, what is appropriate, so then I can in turn enforce that. So what we're really starting to describe here is a process. And so you can represent this as I have here. And I think that one of the things that has really helped by taking this approach is this becomes a very simple way of thinking about a number of different processes that are out there in the market today. And you know, I'm going to walk you through kind of this view of how we can actually, you know, improve our maturity and improve our overall security in our environments over time by following this kind of model. So let's start with just risk. And you know, some of the first things that you need to do is you need to kind of assess what, you know, what's the current state? Where am I today? What do I have currently? So the first stages of this are really, you know, discovering what I have in my environment and classifying it. And so some of the things that we can do around this is, you know, things like inventorying my current assets. What do I have in my environment that I need to deal with? Looking at and discovering where is the data really, both structured and unstructured data. And when I discover where my data is, I then can also go through the process of classifying that data to determine its sensitivity. You know, is this something that I need additional protections around, or additional controls around? Based off of that, I can also look at other parts in my environment with regard to determining what vulnerabilities I have. You know, so whether they're third-party software that I've deployed and I need to make sure I'm patching and taking care of any vulnerabilities that might have been discovered, or preventing vulnerabilities from being introduced in the applications that I'm developing. And then when I have all of that assessment together, I can now start to really calculate where am I today? What does my current risk profile look like? Once I've done that, now I can start to take that and decide, you know, okay, I can't do everything all at once. I have a bunch of things I need to do. What's the low-hanging fruit? Where are the areas that I can get the biggest bang for the buck? And so I can start to prioritize my action plan. I can start to think about what steps I'm going to take first. I can start to define those policies and make decisions as to what I'm going to do about those situations, those conditions, and then start to implement controls and do things like, you know, providing access governance, for instance. You know, first I'm deciding what appropriate access looks like, and then now I'm enforcing those access control decisions. I can leverage identity lifecycle management to help automate the enforcement of those decisions. I can implement access controls across all of my different applications and try to orchestrate the setting of those access controls across my environment. I can also employ encryption to secure, you know, sensitive data where it may be, whether it's, you know, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's structured data in databases or unstructured data in file shares. I can watch to see what applications I might have and make sure that they're behaving the way I expect them to be. So keeping my eye on the overall behavioral patterns of my applications to see if anything starts to behave out of the norm, which might indicate that something has gone wrong or that maybe an application's been compromised. And then also overall, you know, constant detection and analysis, where I'm not only inspecting what's transpiring with the implementation of my controls and measuring their effectiveness, but also identifying where potential other issues might be, that if there's any anomalous activities or any advanced persistent threats, for example, that I need to address. And so having that kind of insight can help me be much more responsive. But it also provides, you know, as I'm doing that inspection, it provides me with feedback into the next iteration of my process. And so I think you can see that this entire process holds true whether you're on-premise, whether you're you know, on different platforms, whether you're containerizing and moving to the cloud, you know, which cloud you're in, as well as you know, how if you're employing, you know, mobile technologies. This same kind of approach holds together. And we can take this back to, you know, understanding, like we were talking about earlier, the relationship between identities, applications, and data, and understanding that that is truly a relationship, that these things constantly interact, as we described earlier, and then applying this additional element of detection, inspection, and analysis to give us that feedback loop. This is, you know, you can think of this together as a closed system now, a closed loop, right? Where not only am I managing those relationships and understanding that better, but I'm also getting the feedback that I need to ensure that it's behaving the way I expect. So a good example of this is, you can think of an example of the autonomic nervous system. So if I reach out and I touch a hot stove, for example, the first thing that happens is there's a signal from my fingertips that go to my muscle that basically retracts my hand from getting any more damage, from burning. And so that happens even before the signal reaches my brain, where I realize that I just burned my hand and I probably shouldn't have done that. So this, our ability to have this kind of feedback loop with regard to this relationship can react very much the same way, is that we have this understanding of who's involved, what actions are being taken and on what. And as that's going on, if I'm watching what's happening, if anything happens outside of the norm, or if I see that there's a problem, I can initiate an immediate response to prevent any further damage from being done. And by having this gives us the ability not only to improve our overall security, but also from a perspective of really enabling the business to really achieve our digital transformation goals. So by empowering the business in this way, having an understanding of this relationship, not only can we, like I said, secure, but also provide better quality of service, have a better understanding of what kinds of services our customers require, being able to be much more responsive to our customers. So all of these things can really help improve and empower the business and really help the bottom line. So I'm going to give 3 examples of this, taking this sort of model of understanding this relationship and this security risk and governance process, and walk you through, how this is similar for breach defense, secure DevOps, as well as data security and privacy. So from a perspective of breach defense, there's another process here. And this is representative of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And if you notice here, this actually is following a very similar pattern to what I described with our security risk and governance process. In fact, it's pretty much the same thing with just slightly different emphasis. When we look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, first off, we start off with the identify stage, which is really the discover and classify and the assessing of risk, just like I was showing you in the risk stage of the earlier process. In fact, the security risk and governance process is just a simplification, if you will, of this, and providing a little bit more emphasis on the decision making, but you're really following the same approach. Once you've identified and classified what's going on in your environment and you've assessed your risk, now with NIST cybersecurity you can start to implement your protective controls. And so these kinds of protective controls would be things to slow down the attack. So implementing zero trust initiatives, as an example, restricting access, putting in least privilege, making sure that the access controls are effective, as well as implementing encryption controls, making sure that the data is secured in the right way. And in many cases, sometimes that's also a balancing act of, you want to make use of the data, but you also want to make sure that it's secured. So instead of operating on the data in its clear form, for example, you could use techniques such as format preserving encryption to basically encrypt the data, but still allow it to be useful and productive even in its encrypted form. The other aspect to this could also be with regard to detection. And so after putting in the protective controls, it's about implementing the detective controls. So the protective controls are all about slowing down the attack. The detective controls are all about quickly identifying where a potential problem is and responding to it. And so here is, again, that's that feedback loop of being able to identify where anomalies are, where different behavioral patterns are deviating from the norm, and then being able to bring the right attention to that so we can react quickly. And then following that kind of real-time monitoring and analysis, we drive incident response. So once I detect this, I can nip any potential problems in the bud right away. The whole idea is minimizing the damage. That's reacting quickly, triggering an effective response, so that way nothing further, no further damage can be done. Nothing further can cause the business to have to deal with this later. So if we can stop the attack before further damages, then the last stage of recovery becomes much easier. And so the whole goal of the recovery phase is getting back to business as usual and leveraging both disaster recovery and business continuity plans as part of that. Now, next example I have is secure DevOps. And so here, it's a similar, this is different from the NIST cybersecurity process, but it's still a process that follows a similar pattern. And here the focus is around agile development, continuous integration, continuous testing, and continuous delivery. But ultimately, to allow us to operate, monitor, and govern these, as quickly as we can, bringing out these new services. And so as part of this, bringing in the different aspects, both for the development process, but also for how we bring these products or these components together, how we guarantee the testing of those products, how we automate that testing and make sure that we're ensuring the quality as it's being delivered quickly, and then being able to roll these things out. So using techniques such as infrastructure as code, for example. So we're putting out well-known, well-vetted components and reusing them as often as possible. As part of this process to have not only a fast approach, but also to guarantee that we're delivering quality. Now, as part of this process, one of the most important things that we need to do here is bring security into this process early. And so it's sort of early and often, right? So every step of the way has aspects of where security can really play. And a lot of the things that we need to be concerned with is that while we're trying to go fast, we don't want to be a blocker to progress. And so in many organizations that have tried to just do a modern DevOps model, where security is overlooked, security becomes the afterthought. Security becomes the gatekeeper at the end before you can deploy. That potentially could say no, that you can't deploy because you didn't do everything. Well, by bringing that in earlier, by implementing the right controls as part of the process, we can actually make sure that all of those things, all those concerns are taken care of as we go, rather than waiting to the very end. And so things like, for instance, ensuring that developers aren't administrative equivalent in production. Which is a big issue if you're not paying attention to what's going on with this process. Making sure that the right roles for each of the parties that participate in this process are being followed. From a perspective of ensuring that developers can't approve their own tests, for example. So all of these things are starting to be, as you can see, these are access challenges as part of the secure DevOps process. So this is another area where zero trust really plays in. And then also with data privacy and security. So we have, again, this is similar to what we were showing earlier with the NIST cybersecurity framework, but this is specific to the NIST privacy framework. And so it follows a similar model, but again, the emphasis changes. So while you'll notice that the identify and protect stage are very similar, and yes, we are still implementing access and encryption controls, the difference with data privacy and security in this case is really focusing on the next two stages of control and inform. And this is really really focused on data stewardship and data lifecycle management. And what I mean by that is that we actually have to make some additional decisions. So you could see how the privacy framework could actually work very closely in coordination with the cybersecurity framework. But to understand the privacy concerns and the data security concerns, we need to first take a step back and think about what data are we working on? And is this data that I need? Is this data that I should actually hold on to? And so going through the stages of control, for example, are really about making those decisions up front, putting together criteria as to whether or not, this is, because as I'm doing my normal operations, I'm going to encounter different kinds of data. If it's data that I need to hold on to, then I can make sure I'm putting in place the right controls, make sure I'm putting in the right security around that and protecting it effectively. But if it's data that I don't need to hold on to, I need to dispose of it responsibly. I need to make sure that if this is not necessary, I should get rid of it, not hold on to it, reduce my overall liability as well as any privacy exposure, but ensure that that data is properly destroyed. I can't just leave it hanging around. And this is very much in reaction to kind of the era where, as we started to embrace big data techniques, there was a whole approach to just give me everything. I'll just put everything into my data lake. And I don't know what I'm going to use it for, but maybe it'll be useful later. Well, that's a data privacy nightmare. And people are starting to realize that that's maybe not such a good idea, and it's actually much better to take this approach of really deciding what is it that I need up front and putting in the right policies around managing that life cycle of how I interact with data, both bringing data in, using data, and disposing of data when I don't need it anymore, which basically helps overall with the nature of the security that you have to put in place, as well as helps with the overall privacy profile of the organization. And in fact, what we're really trying to do here is demonstrate that we're good stewards of the data, that we're responsible, and that we can now give that confidence to our customers. Okay, and so that takes us to the whole aspect of inform, and the inform stage is really around providing that additional transparency, demonstrating all of the things that I'm doing to be a good data steward, so that way you can rely on me and you can basically be comfortable with my operations and how I interact with your data. And then the last stage, of course, again, is this view on if when as I'm going through this, there's still going to be issues, there's still going to be incidents, and I need to be transparent and quick in my incident response, and I need to be able to demonstrate that I've got this, and again, this is the other part where it ties back into the NIST cybersecurity framework. So when you start employing these kinds of techniques, this is what starts to open up for us, is that it actually gives us a level of maturity that we can carry forward. And the more that we can act on those processes and take those processes to heart, we can start to advance our maturity down the path. And so from this perspective is that we've started out at a place of where we were assuming trust, right? And that was again all about securing the perimeter. It had this view of really approaching this from different security silos and just slapping a bunch of point solutions together. And that level of assumed trust is actually fairly low in maturity and only carries you so far. And yes, it's better than nothing, but it's also, it gets to a point where our the threats that we're dealing with and the challenges that we have in general start to overwhelm that approach. So that's why we started moving to more of a zero trust model. And this is all about verification. And we have the ability to do this continuous verification, if you will, by employing these least privileged models, by adopting more risk-based approaches, evaluating always what's appropriate. And that continuous evaluation really helps us make for a better experience and improves the overall maturity. And where this actually starts to take us to, though, is a much more productive approach with regard to recognition. And so this is where we come into what we've been coining as adaptive intelligence. This means understanding the dynamic context of what's going on And this also starts to take advantage of a lot of the analytics and machine learning techniques that we've been bringing to bear. So now not only can you build on top of this concept of least privilege, but now I can be much more predictive. I can watch behavior over time and understand exactly what's going on, which opens up to other areas around continuous authentication and continuous authorization. And what I mean by that is that it's not just about authenticating you at the beginning of the process. I need to make sure that you are still who you say you are throughout the session. So if you get up and leave and somebody hijacks your session, I should be able to recognize that that's not you anymore. And so having that view and being able to provide that kind of dynamic context, now I can be much more responsive and provide much better response and remediation. So let's touch on a couple of examples here with regard to this. So first off, when we look at how an adaptive access control system can work, risk becomes central to this equation. So we take in all of these different inputs from users, from devices, from things, from other services, and based off of that, we can look at all these different parameters, all these different dynamic variables, if you will, to inform what our current risk is. And based off of that, we can make a determination of, is this a low risk activity? Is this a medium risk activity? Is this a high risk activity? So by applying this helps us decide, again, is this appropriate? And if it is, then we can make the decisions as to whether we can allow or whether we need additional information or whether, no, I'm sorry, we're going to deny this because there's not enough. And so this gives us this ability to adapt, with regard to any changing current conditions. And examples of this really come down to the following. So here's a view of adaptive access. So if we look at all of these different parameters, and these are just examples. This is not the only things that we can look at, but as an example, we can look across all of these parameters. Not only that you've provided the right username and password, and that you're coming from the right place on the internet, and we understand kind of where you are from a location standpoint, and you've provided the right device fingerprinting and so forth. And your behavior pattern is in line with everything that we've seen you do in the past. This gives us a confidence that, okay, based off of this risk score, you're a fairly low risk, okay? Whereas opposed to that, if we looked at a different pattern where some of these parameters have shifted, you can see that, well, in this case, you still provided the right username and password, but there's a bunch of things here that look kind of fishy. Your behavior pattern is way off the norm, and you're not coming from a normal location, and the whole view on your IP address and history does not line up with what we would expect. All of these things, all these different conditions now leads to a much higher risk score. And so from this perspective, we can, by looking at all those parameters and taking all that into account, we can make a determination that, okay, maybe this is a compromised account. Maybe this is something that it's not worth the risk to allow access at this stage. And given the extent of the risk, we can determine, is it even worth trying to do a step up and challenge further, or do we just deny it outright? And so, from that perspective, again, taking all of this into account, Micro Focus provides a very rich portfolio to help with all of these kinds of elements that you'd bring to bear to employ a complete, security risk and governance program. So the way we look at this is that while we have a very complete portfolio of providing identity and access management to really help with things like zero trust, we also have endpoint security, our security operations for being able to monitor and detect those kinds of anomalies, as well as from a data security perspective, both from data governance and protection as well as information archiving, and also application security. We base all of this around our analytics and machine learning technologies, and with this, we see this can help really fill out all of the gaps that an organization might have in trying to pursue any one of these processes. Following that security risk and governance model, if you will. And our goal with what we provide with this broad portfolio is that we know that organizations have made investments in many of these areas, but that a lot of these we can make use of those investments and actually make them better and add value to them by filling in a lot of the gaps that may be apparent within those environments. And so by looking to Micro Focus, we can actually help provide additional value where it's needed most. And so ultimately, in closing, we should really look at zero trust as a philosophy. Taking a more process-oriented view of these security challenges can really go a long way, and zero trust is one of those processes. And as part of this, zero trust is always viewed as a way of always asking if this is appropriate. And if we're constantly making that assessment on an ongoing basis with every activity, that is a surefire way to improve the overall security within the organization.
Awesome. That's good stuff, Nick. Thanks for taking us through that.
Thank you.
I got a bunch of questions lined up here for you too, so grab a sip of water while I go through these just last couple of slides. Listen, everybody that's on the call, thanks for coming, but we are going to answer your questions. Before we get to that, I just want to draw attention to the fact that we have our Micro Focus Universe coming up in the next couple of weeks here. Typically, this was a live and in-person session, but as you know, with everything that's going on in the world today, everything has gone virtual. That's the same case for our universe. It's free, so you can see at the very bottom of your screen there, or the bottom of the slide, is where you can go register for our virtual universe. And we will be talking about zero trust among other things. I have a little slide here that kind of talks about some of the stuff that we are going to be covering. When we look at our security risk and governance portfolio, that covers our next-gen SOC, the zero trust stuff, and the identity and access management stuff we talked about today, application security, data privacy. So we're going to be covering a lot of sessions in and around. This will be probably 20 live ones, and there will be a bunch of recorded ones as well. So if that interests you, I highly recommend you go register for that and join us virtually on the 19th through the 21st of this month. All right, let's start with the questions. This was the first one that was submitted while you were talking, Nick, and I think it's probably one of the most relevant ones because there is a lot of hype around zero trust. So how do you separate the hype from fact when looking at zero trust? And that's a loaded question, and we've got about 12 minutes. So if you have other questions, so I just want to leave that with you.
Yeah, we could probably spend another 45 minutes just talking about that too.
Just talking about that, absolutely.
But so first off, I mean, the understanding kind of where zero trust came from, right? And this also comes back to the view of that there were certain assumptions, and so zero trust was actually coined by a gentleman by the name of John Kindervag, who used to be a Forrester analyst. And he has a network security background, and actually left Forrester and now works at Palo Alto Networks. And so Palo Alto is currently promoting zero trust concepts quite a bit as part of that. And so there is a lot of hype around it in the sense that it's a new buzzword. But there is a key element to this that I think is very important, is that we're realizing that this approach of defining a perimeter and basically making those assumptions was realized as being ineffective, and so by really starting to employ this view of really understanding who you're dealing with and bringing that identity context into the mix, changes the game in a big way with regard to zero trust. And so this allows for, basically, I think a very effective approach where it's the fact of the matter is that if you actually start looking at these areas of implementing least privilege, you can actually get significant gain. Now, it doesn't mean, this is, on a spectrum too. This doesn't mean that you need to achieve, so tight a controls that nobody can move, but that you're not, if you have the right processes in place where you're, helping, mindfully issue entitlement, for example, you're assessing that, issuance of entitlement in an effective way on an ongoing basis, and you're automating the revocation of entitlement when it's no longer required, you can basically progress towards a least privileged model, and that really is a very effective way of bringing zero trust to bear. It's also, you have to think about this too, is it depends on, again, your perspective. If you're operating in network security, as an example, the real work that's being done in zero trust is really around this microsegmentation. And again, network security doesn't have a view into the identity context like identity and access management does. So we kind of have to think about this as a multi-pronged approach or a layered approach. You want to use both. And so breaking things down using microsegmentation techniques certainly helps, but it's not the whole picture. Bringing in the identity and access management context and leveraging that helps a great deal, actually, but it's not the whole picture. And so bringing these things together in a meaningful way actually brings the reality of zero trust to bear. And they're just good practices in general. So that's kind of where I think the best way to sort of penetrate the hype is come down to grounding exactly how can you actually improve the security in the environment, how can you, and then keeping like I was mentioning earlier in the breach defense example, the whole goal here is to slow down the potential for attacks. So if an attacker succeeds in compromising something, how can you minimize what they can do while buying you time to detect them and do something about it? And so having that kind of really pragmatic approach, I think, can really help make this much more effective for your organization.
So what you're saying is that there isn't a product that solves their zero trust problems.
That's correct. That's correct.
Don't believe the hype. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so here's another one for you. Is SSO a capability that reinforces zero trust, or is it counterintuitive to that philosophy?
That's a really good question.
It is.
There's always a balance, that's going on between, trying to make things easier to use, being less intrusive, versus, being able to, basically secure the things, appropriately, right? And zero trust, single sign-on is one of those things. Now, can single sign-on be implemented in a way that you're not really compromising security and still be in tune with these zero trust concepts? Yes, I believe so. Is it that you're trying to optimize to some degree? Well, yeah. I mean, if you think about a good example is federation, for instance, you could basically summarize federation in the simple term of, are you somebody that somebody I trusts? So that's kind of counter to zero trust in some degree, but I can still verify it, right? So if you've been authenticated sufficiently by a process that I have control over, where I know that there's been an effective enough set of checks that were put in place, and I have a good level of assurance that you have been identified to that degree, then the fact that you're handing me that information to base my decision off of is is okay. You know, is it pushing the boundary of the concept? Yeah, it is. But I think that, you know, there's enough protections in place as part of that, and the protocols are well defined enough that you can still achieve the benefits of single sign-on without necessarily forcing you know, an authentication every 5 minutes, you know, or every step along the way you're getting hit with another password and or another challenge. And I think that's the issue is that we want to make sure that people can be effective and do their jobs while still guaranteeing that we're having the right level of verifications.
Cool. All right, so we got about 4 minutes left, and we've got more questions than we have time. So for those of you that have submitted questions, if we don't get to them, if I forget to say it, we will get back to you via email. All right, here's another one for you. Are there fundamental differences between zero trust architecture and general IT controls we implement to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover while securing assets? That sounds like a combination between zero trust and the NIST framework. But
yes.
I'll leave that one with you. Yeah.
Well, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, they're actually many of the same things. That's kind of the reason why I pointed out zero trust as a philosophy, in that you want to employ a lot of these general IT controls that you should be doing anyway, but do them in an effective way where you're not making these kinds of assumptions as part of that. So you could, for instance, implement a lot of these IT controls in a way that you know, that you would not be following a zero trust philosophy. So we've been implementing IT controls forever, you know, in going back to sort of that first example that I used of a overly simplistic network security model. You know, if I define this hard perimeter, I put in these controls there, but I'm not looking at all the other different aspects, and I'm making assumptions that only the things I need to worry about are on the other side. That's where we run into trouble. Okay, and so the change there would be is that, okay, well, realize the perimeter is not as, you know, as rigid as we thought it was, that it really is dissolving from that perspective, and that we have to implement these additional controls in other areas. So you're basically, you can't put all your, you know, you again, thinking of this as a layered approach, you can't put all of your eggs in one basket. You can't put all your defenses at one point in your defense strategy. You have to have that in stages all along the way. And so instead of thinking of a rigid perimeter, if you will, and a wall, you know, defending your lands, if you will, you know, if you look at back in the medieval days, you know, castle design had many defenses. You could always fall back to the next level of defenses to protect somebody from getting all the way in. That's kind of what we're doing here, is we're implementing all of these additional controls in these areas to ensure that, you know, like through microsegmentation, through, you know, better identity and access management and so forth, and least privilege models, that you can only do so much if any one of these defenses ultimately fails.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we have a minute left. So this is the last question, and you don't have to answer it quickly, even though it's a loaded one. How do you determine the measure of risk for different parameters, especially if it's a non-quantitative measure? Is there a guideline on the parameters and their measures available?
That's that is a much harder question to answer.
Yeah.
I'm almost thinking that might be one that we need to take offline, because I don't think I have enough time to answer that. Yeah.
All right. How about this one then? What are the downsides of taking zero trust as just a matter of implementing some technology tools in a phased manner? I mean, that one you could probably get through a little bit quicker, I think.
Yeah. So again, you know, looking at zero trust as a philosophy. I mean, you are employing a lot of these technology tools in a phased manner. I mean, you should be, but the key to this is making sure, you know, that you're implementing these techniques, right? You know, I can't, you know, and again, depends on what layer you're dealing with as well. You know, so microsegmentation at one layer, but when we're talking about identity and access management in particular, it's really all about least privilege. And so if you're employing techniques to achieve least privilege. You're doing access review. You're doing access certification. You're automating those decisions for entitlement issuance, for example. So you have a really good handle on how those entitlements are being doled out. You're aligning your encryption strategy with your access strategy, so that way they reinforce each other instead of being completely separate from each other. Those are techniques that follow the zero trust philosophy. Now, each of those techniques are great on their own too, but the whole idea is bringing this together as a more complete approach.
Cool. All right, we're out of time. We're a minute and 3 seconds over. So for those of you that I didn't, or the questions we didn't get to, we will email back on that. One last question for me: is the slide deck available? It will be made available as part of the on-demand stuff, so you'll be able to download it from there. But that is all the time we have today. Thank you for the questions. There were some pretty serious and awesome questions, so that's really good. Like I said, for the ones that we didn't respond to, we'll get to you back by through email. And again, like I said at the beginning, and what I just said a couple seconds ago, there'll be a replay of today's event, and a PDF copy of the slides will be available through on demand. That'll be done shortly. And of course, we're going to invite you to share them with your colleagues and all that kind of stuff, which would be cool. Anyway, listen, thank you for everybody that came and joined today. We appreciate you taking the time and kind of seeing how Micro Focus is going through some of this stuff. But that does conclude our event. We wish you a great day, and everybody stay safe and stay healthy. Thanks again for coming.